Well, thank you to the Ann Arbor Library and thank you for attending. Start my slideshow. Oh yeah. So I can try to start my slideshow. How do I get it to come up? Oh, we good? Okay. So today's talk is about the Arabic language, its richness, complexity, and some of its awesomeness, or a lot of its awesomeness, as much as I can fit into a short talk. To start, here's the agenda. I'm going to introduce myself a little bit more because some of, I think, the background that I have is going to be relevant for the talk today, especially regarding education and teaching the language. I'm going to do a little background, just generally, what is the Arabic language? Then we're going to review 3 parts about it: the alphabet and script, just really quick introductions. Arabic morphology, I like to challenge myself, so I want to see if I can teach Arabic morphology in 5 to 10 minutes, basically. And so at another talk, I was able to do Arabic syntax in about 10 minutes, and there was a professor in the audience, and he paused everybody, and he said, "You do realize he just taught a semester of Arabic in 10 minutes." So that's my goal for today. Then we're going to talk about one of the most challenging and interesting aspects of Arabic, which is diglossy and dialects. And then I want to talk a little bit about learning Arabic before we leave you with some parting words. So a little bit about me. I grew up here in Michigan. I'm Lebanese American. I hated Arabic growing up. I went to the private school on Plymouth Road, Michigan Islamic Academy. And after getting out of there, I never wanted anything to do with Arabic for a long time. I did my undergrad at Eastern Michigan University in art with a minor in math. And then afterwards, I did Peace Corps in South Africa, which is where I really learned to actually love learning a local language. And it was because it embodied the people. The language was actually an embodiment of their culture and so forth. So after coming back, I did a graduate degree in public policy and another in Middle East studies. I finished in 2010. I did a graduate study abroad program in Egypt for a year. And then I started working. I wanted to work in Arabic education development, but at that time, all of the money was really going to aid work and so forth. So that's what I ended up working in for a while until I had a child and ended up trying to settle down a little bit more rather than running around. So what is Arabic? So what we know is classical Arabic, or standard Arabic, was codified about 1,600 years ago after the founding of Islam. It's based on the Quran, so it's one of the founding documents, if you will, of the language from which it was codified, as well as pre- and post-Islamic poetry and other documents. There's also a whole bunch of dialects. We don't, as linguists, nobody really agrees on exactly how many, but we'll talk a little bit more about them later. Now, what's interesting about Arabic is that even though the vocabulary has changed, for standard Arabic, phonetically and grammatically, it's largely the same. So like I can read really old poetry from 1600 years ago. I might not understand all the references. So I was reading one recently and it made a reference to white Indians. And I had to look it up because what it actually was referring to was white Indian steel. And so in this case, swords, which was considered like high quality steel at the time. And to this day, Arabic retains a lot of words from really ancient languages that are preserved pretty much as is. So like saha, we use that regularly as a field or open area. We even to this day, use it to refer to a playground. Rif is the countryside, and that's from ancient Egyptian or Akkadian, depending on who you ask. Where is Arabic used and spoken? So it's listed in 24 countries as the official or co-official language, among them Palestine. There's also, it's used in places like Somaliland and Zanzibar as well. So those aren't counted in that 24. Arabic is also learned by Muslims throughout the world because it is the language of the Quran. Now, for Muslims who learn it, who are not learning it as a language to speak every day and things like that, they tend to focus more on memorizing the Quran and how to read it and understand it and things like that. So Arabic belongs to the Semitic language family. And here I'm going to pause and ask, does anyone have a definition for a Semitic language? Or any other examples? Egyptian and Hebrew are, as well as Aramaic, Syriac, a number of other languages. What makes them Semitic is that they're based on this idea of a root and pattern structure. So a root is usually 3 letters. They're not an actual word. They tend to represent a concept. So we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the morphology part. And you take those 3 letters and you put them into what we call patterns, which are basically prefixes and suffixes and different vowels. You change them around, and that's how you make words. So we'll get to like some interesting examples with that as we go along. So English words that come from Arabic. So algebra, you've probably heard, comes from Arabic. It comes from the word al-jabr. Al-jabr actually refers to the concept of restoration. So there was a mathematician, al-Khwarizmi, who wrote a book, I want to say in the 9th century, and it was about basically balancing equations. And in the title of it was Al-Jabr wal-Muqabala, the restoration and balancing of equations. That gets translated into Latin, and from that you get the word algebra. And the AL is kind of a hint sometimes that a word actually came from Arabic. Alcohol comes from al-kuhul. Kuhul is eyeliner, actually. So alcohol started to be used to refer to, first of all, to any kind of distilled liquid or anything like that because of the process. It wasn't actually until, I think, the 18th century that it started to refer instead to, or specifically to intoxicating spirits or alcohol as we know it today. The word 0 comes from the Arabic sifr. So in a long history of this word, to see how far back we can trace it, it actually originally comes from India, where the word was used to refer to the concept of nothingness in religion. Now, somewhere along the way, and I'm not 100% sure where, Arab traders, I think, started to use it to refer to 0 in their when balancing accounts and so forth. That 0 then becomes widespread within the Middle East for usage within the Arab countries. It doesn't actually move up into Europe until around the 15th century when the very well-known Italian mathematician Fibonacci, he brings it over. He grew up actually in what is now Tunisia in North Africa. Europe at the time did not want to accept the concept of nothingness, and so it took them like a couple centuries to get around to that. But eventually they accepted that we can put nothing. Artichoke, kind of interesting word here. So artichoke comes from al-khurshuf. Now, what's interesting is that the word artichoke has made its way back into Arabic. And now Arabs say artishoki, which means ground thorn, because if you think, and they justify it, they're like, oh, it's a ground thorn, right? Look at the shape of it, it's kind of pokey and stuff. But it actually originally comes from al-khurshuf, goes into English and makes its way back. Sugar comes from sukkar. So this one also actually goes all the way back to Sanskrit, where the word originally refers specifically to candied or ground sugar. It goes into Persian as shakar, comes into Arabic as sukkar. And there's some dialects actually in Arabic that still use the word shakar. And then it eventually makes its way to Latin, I believe as sukarum, and then from there to French, and finally to English. The word mosque comes from masjid, and here's where I have to have a little bit of a disinformation campaign. Growing up, I was told that mosque came because when Muslims were being driven out of Islamic Spain, Al-Andalus, that one of them, I think maybe the queen or someone, said we're going to squash them like mosquitoes in their mosque. That's not at all where it comes from, okay? So Spanish doesn't have a J, right? So when they transliterated it, they put a Q. And it was said, I believe, mosquite. And then it goes into French, and French have issues with final consonants, so they drop that, and it becomes mosquée. And then I'm not actually 100% sure why the final vowel got dropped when it came to English, but then it just becomes mosque. And that's how we have it. And hummus is just hummus. But it is interesting to note because like with modern technology and stuff, the word stays the same. We might change the pronunciation a bit as it comes into English, but the word stays the same. So here's the Arabic script. It actually starts, it's right to left. So the first letter is up here on this side. That's an alif and then a ba. There's 28 letters. These are predominantly consonants, with the exception of the first letter there, and then the last two letters, they can be vowels or consonants. Now, these are all the names. Does anybody want to take a guess at what we call the Arabic alphabet? I'll give you a hint. It's kind of similar to English and how we derive the name for the English alphabet. Alif Ba, there we go. Yes, exactly. The Alif Ba, that's what we call it. Same thing, alpha, beta, and Alif Ba. So, like I said, most of those are pretty much consonants, except for, like I said, the first one and the last two. So to create vowels, we use diacritic marks. And these are put above or below the letter. So this first letter, for instance, this is just an SH, sh, but with this diacritic mark here, it becomes a shu. And this one is the b, like a B sound, but with this diacritic mark here, it becomes a b. And then this one here is an M sound, it's a meme, and with this on top, it becomes a ma, like a sound, short A. Obviously, there are a lot more, and you, depending on, you can mix them with some of the long vowels, for instance, and change the sound. And the tone of them can also change depending on the letters that are around them. I say that because it's not simply 3 vowels. There's a lot much more complex system going on here. And we have, all Arabic is written with a cursive script. There's actually cards in the back that you guys can take, postcards. You can take them and send them to people. But the way it works basically, you take your letters, and so this is the word marhaba for hello. It starts with a ra, ha, ba, alif, and then you put it together. When you write it, it's like that. So there's actually no way of saying print your name on a form properly, not in a literal translation. There is unfortunately a Google Translate that has become widespread where people would say print, but it's the word for printing paper from a printer or something like that. The better translation, if anybody asks you, is to say that write your name in clear letters. You know, don't like a quick cursive script. Here's another word, sharaf. Sharaf means honor. These words are going to come up again, right? You're going to get tested, watch out, at the end. So Arabs love to make sort of art of their language in a lot of different ways. There's poetry, there's literature, calligraphy is a really big one. These all say the same thing, hubban fil lugha, which means for the love of language. This one on the far right is an oval shape, or yeah, you're right, it's an oval shape or eye shape. In the middle you have a circle, and here this is like a flame shape. And these are kind of common themes that you'll see within them. But Arabic calligraphy actually varies quite a bit when you out of region. There's a lot of kind of standardized stuff, and a lot of it's religious, but like this one here, you can see the website here is based in South Africa, Dean Arts Foundation. It's kind of a Chinese style or Chinese influenced calligraphy. And there's some really interesting stuff. Like I said, when you start browsing around, you can find like whole Chinese characters, but when you zoom in on it, it's like a big poster. It's all little tiny Arabic words written out. It's really amazing. Okay, so now we're going to talk about that root pattern system and whether or not I can teach Arabic morphology in 5 to 10 minutes, right? So I'm timing myself here, I'm checking the time. Okay, so here are 2 words from Arabic, but we all know them in English, right? Muslim and Islam. So here's what we have to do. We have to find what are the consonants that are 3 consonants that are shared between the 2 and in the same order. Any takers? SLM? Yeah. So that's the pattern right there. That's your root. So the root here is SLM. And you put, the pattern is, for this first word, you have a mu at the beginning, that's your prefix, and then you have an infix here, your vowel in the middle. And here for the first one, you have an I at the beginning and an A after that. And the root SLM refers to the idea of submission or peace. So a Muslim is one who has submitted to God. But from the same root, we get a whole bunch of words, actually. We get words like istaslam is to surrender, taslim is to submit something, salam is peace. there's a whole bunch of words you derive from a single root. I have a picture coming up where it has like a big tree where you can see a whole bunch of words derived from a single root. So let's play a game here. Let's do the same thing. What are the 3 consonants that are shared between the 2 words in the same order? So if you change the order, it becomes a different root. QRB, okay. So again, this is a common root. Istaqraba means to consider or perceive something as being near. And qara'ib or qara'ib are your relatives, those who are near to you. And the root QRB refers to nearness. Again, you have a lot of words that are derived from it, like qarib and so forth, which means near. So here's the last one. We already did marhaba, and here's another word from the same root, tarhib. What are the 3 consonants that are shared between the 2 in the same order? Yeah, RHB. Yeah, RHB. So the root RHB refers to welcoming someone typically. So you have marhaba is hello, tarhib is welcoming. Urahibu bikum, I welcome you. Urahib means I welcome. So there we go. That was quick, right? That was like Arabic morphology, really quick. Okay, so of course, like that was pretty basic. When you really get into it, one single root, you can derive all these different words from it. And I'll tell you, like, when you have if you raise a kid, right, with a language, they get used to it, and you'll have them sometimes derive things incorrectly, if you will, or they'll make up a word. So they'll be like, look at all the fishes, or something like that. And it isn't until later that they learn, oh, we say fish for singular and plural. English is pretty straightforward. Our suffix and prefix system is pretty basic compared to a lot of languages. What's amazing is that the human mind, even with these complex derivations, they can get used to it. So as an example, my son, when he was 3 years old or so, I'm sitting around cooking and he's pretending to cook next to me. And he's like, I'm haddar al-tarati. I'm preparing the tarati. And I'm like, tarati, what is he doing? And then I'm like, okay, whatever, I gotta cook right now, right? And he keeps sitting around talking about tarati, tarati, tarati. Finally, I'm like, Ayaz, what are tarati? And he's like, the tortillas, Dad, don't you know? So he took this word tortilla and he derived an Arabic plural from it on his own, like as a 3-year-old, just like, oh yeah, this is a logical pattern to go with. And it really becomes like a game for him. Like after, like he just thinks, oh yeah, I can do this with any word I want. I can derive all sorts of stuff. It makes sense. So it's amazing, like the human mind can just do that. So okay, diglossy and dialects. And I have to warn, this is a little bit of a soapbox for me, but I'm trying not to make it that for this. But it is important to understand, because growing up, this was never really explained to me, and it's part of why the language was a struggle growing up. So diglossia is a situation in which 2 languages or 2 varieties of the same language are used under different conditions within a community. So in Arabic, we have what we call classical Arabic or modern standard Arabic. And then there are a whole bunch of different dialects, about 30 depending on who you ask and how they're categorizing them. So English obviously has its own dialects as well, but English is a more unified language. The dialects tend to be mutually understandable. So except in a few circumstances, it wouldn't be considered diglossia, or the situation. I say the situation because linguists here who might be listening would say diglossia refers to a situation and not a language. A language is not diglossic, a situation is. So even though in Arabic, the translation of diglossia is often applied to the language itself, I think because of how dependent the languages have become on each other, how interdependent they are. So in contrast to English, where a lot of these dialects, the English dialects are mutually understandable, in Arabic, they're not always mutually understandable. And so the gap between them is much bigger. So I'm gonna actually give some examples of that so you can kind of think about that. There is, of course, a lot of shared vocabulary. All Arabs learn some classical Arabic in school. As long as you're going there, actually the entire education system is in classical Arabic. And dialects actually aren't acknowledged, which ends up having a lot of downstream consequences. But their knowledge or exposure for Arabs to other dialects depends on their own personal circumstances. Do they travel a lot? Do they have friends from outside of the region? Do they engage with a lot of media from outside of their country and so forth? So a couple quick examples to illustrate how big, how different the dialects are to each other. One of them I'll show the website first. So here's the website. This is my website here. I'm gonna search for one word, all right? I'm gonna search for the word cat. So here, you can see on the website, each one of these acts as a separate dictionary, and this is how, over time, I've had to build the system, is that each dialect is treated as its own, because they're so different that even if you have the same word, it might be used a little bit differently in another dialect, or the words might be entirely different. So I search for the word cat here. In classical Arabic, the common word for cat is going to be qitta. But if you jump over to, let's say, like Iraqi, they're going to say bazoune. And if you jump all the way down to Yemeni, they're going to say dimma. So each one of them has different dialects. Now, some of them are shared. We'll all, like pretty much all Arabs will understand qitta. Some of them will say it utta or atta or some other gitta or some other pronunciation of it, but we'll understand it. But then these other ones that aren't as common, they might not be understood. And when you're traveling through a country, if somebody says, like, watch out for the dimma, you know, even an Arab might not understand what they're referring to if they're from another country. So going back to this, oops. How do I get it back to? Sorry, one sec. Technical difficulties here. Okay. Okay. So another example to show how different they are, in English, between English and German, if we do a comparison, the website Ethnologue estimates that English and German, you know, when you kind of adjust for phonetic differences and so forth, they have about a 60% overlap of vocabulary, ignoring grammatical differences and things like that. So basically 60% shared words, if you can figure out how to connect them. In a study I co-authored with my brother, who's can raise his hand if he wants, we showed that using the dictionary data on the Living Arabic website, there's about a 50% overlap between any one dialect and Standard Arabic. So give or take, you know, on an error rate and things like that, you were looking at a difference that's about the same as between English and German. Of course, the difference is, though, that with diglossia, you're raised to a certain extent with both. That your dialect is your mother tongue. It's what you grow up speaking. It's what you learn in the household. What's different is that classical Arabic is nobody's native language anymore. Nobody grows up speaking classical Arabic. It's actually, in linguistics, one scholar called it frozen diglossia, because Standard Arabic isn't developing independently anymore with its own community. So because of that, when you get put in school and you have to get taught in classical Arabic, which is essentially a foreign language to you, it's hard to get used to and it ends up having other consequences. So before I talk about those consequences a little bit, and a little bit at the end of this about how to get around them, or what I think is an approach to get around them, one more example of how different the dialects can be. Different ways of saying I want. In classical or Standard Arabic, the most common word is uridu. In Egyptian, they say ana ayiz. In Levantine, they say baddi. In Yemeni, they say ashti. In Iraqi, they say arid. In Moroccan, bghi. And in the Gulf, they say bgha or abbi or abghi, or, you know, some variation of basically abgha. What's even crazier is that these aren't even all verbs. Egyptian and Levantine here, they don't use verbs to express that idea. And in this case, Iraqi arid is probably the closest to classical Arabic, in this case, uridu. But that's not always the case. In other cases, the words in Iraqi are quite different. So the impact of how we treat diglossia, and one of the things I want to emphasize is I really think it's how we treat it. Diglossia itself, as I say up here on the slide, I would say actually has a very positive side, which is that by changing how we look at language to see it as a multilingual system, we're actually able to tie together a very long history as well as very different regions, which isn't something that you can do if you just try to look at each language as a single system on its own. So changing how we look at language really does there's a really beautiful side to diglossia. But how we treat it, putting kids into school and not explaining, not helping them bridge from their parent dialect to classical Arabic, not teaching the basics of reading in your spoken dialect and then slowly transferring to classical Arabic, these have a lot of impacts. So one example of that is 5 wealthy Gulf countries: Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE. And I choose them because they're very wealthy countries, right? Top GDP in the world per capita. They actually, I think, spend on average more on education than other countries in the same category, the same GDP category. So they have what we call a below minimum proficiency index of 36.6%, meaning that 36.6% of fourth graders cannot read a basic text. And in comparison, other countries with a similar GDP have only a 2.7%. That's a really big difference. Kids struggle with Arabic. I mentioned at the beginning I was going to reflect back on my own, how I was raised and the challenges that I faced with it and things like that. A lot of kids struggle with Arabic and they hate it. And a bunch of other consequences. You can read about some of them if you Google these titles here. These are articles that I've written. They're not heavy academic articles. They're more light articles, but they talk about some of these issues. In particular, like low publishing rates in the Middle East. There's just not as many books published. Interesting studies about how, even Arabic editors, they're kind of like always worried about making mistakes when they're editing and things like that. So if you're more interested in that topic, here are some articles to look at, and feel free to talk to me afterwards or ask questions because we have plenty of time. So is Arabic hard to learn? We've talked about a lot of different things today. I'm going to start actually by telling a story. I knew this guy, older guy, he's probably retired now, but he was a really accomplished linguist. He spoke and translated from Mandarin Chinese. Obviously, he spoke English as well, Persian, Arabic, Hebrew, as well as like some European languages. I know at least French and Spanish. And he said to me, of all of these, Arabic was by far the hardest. And I said, even harder than Chinese? And he's like, well, the tonal system in Mandarin Chinese is harder. It takes a little while to get used to. Well, after you get used to it, Mandarin is actually pretty straightforward from a grammatical perspective. Arabic, in contrast, there's always something new wherever you go. And there's always a new dialect, and it's a different accent and different tones and different words and different even grammatical structure, and it's hard to constantly adapt and get used to that without exposure. And one article I recently read, a linguist said, she's like, I had to back out of a meeting as an interpreter because it was a dialect I'd never heard before, and I didn't want to just like fake it and try to get through it. So it really is a challenge. So that said, we've talked a lot about alphabet, script, Semitic roots, and morphology, grammar a little bit, not too much, but a long and complex history, which really adds up over time. When you think about it, 1,600 years of changing vocabulary and things like that, that really can make it difficult to adapt to, but it's interesting too. But it comes down to dialects and diglossia are what make it hard. That's what makes it challenging to learn. So is there a way around that? And I think actually there is. And me coming back as an adult and properly learning Arabic after all those years is one example. And then becoming this nerd who has this website. By the way, I didn't say this at the beginning. So the website started out, I finished grad school in 2010. I think the website went up in 2013 was when I first put it up. Had 10,000 words. That was it. Right now, it has 250,000 words and is still growing. And one professor recently reached out. He's like, I can't believe it's been over a decade and you're the only show in town still. So it keeps growing. And people would reach out to me at the beginning and they'd be like, who are you? And I'm like, I'm just this guy who likes Arabic. This is what I do. That's it. Now you can find articles I've written and things like that. But at the beginning, it was just like, I just want to do it. So, okay, so here's what I'm going to suggest as a basic, very basic path to success. First of all, learn the alphabet, of course, just the very basics of it. And for adult learners, I suggest actually the book used by most universities now, Al-Kitab, by Christine Brudstad and Abbas al-Tunsi and Mahmoud al-Batal. It's a really good introduction to just, here's how the alphabet works, here's how you write words, here are some basic words you can learn, and they're very well aware of diglossia and things like that. But now, I'm going to tell you something that most people won't tell you. I'm going to say, go ground yourself in a dialect. Now, a lot of people tell you, no, go learn standard Arabic first. It's the core, it's the heart of all of it, and then it'll be easier. I'm going to tell you, no. And if they try to insist on it, tell them, this Arabic nerd who insisted on it. But the honest fact is now that there are more studies out, one is it doesn't help to learn standard Arabic first, but the bigger challenge is that because standard Arabic is nobody's mother tongue, you end up with limited material that you can interact with, most of it formal and boring. A lot of students, they spend their whole time, trying to read articles in the news, which is just miserable to sit around and read news articles all the time. Your video access tends to be more formal things or scientific things and stuff like that. Again, not really very exciting. You want to, like I said, a language embodies people. And so part of the point for me giving this talk is to try to change what I hope is kind of the perception around that and give an approach for people to see a different side of Arabic. So ground yourself in a dialect. I think for me, one of the best ways to do it is actually to use the Pimsleur app, because for Levantine and Egyptian, it has 3 levels for each one. Each one is a set of 30-minute lessons. So 30-minute lessons. So 90 lessons each for Egyptian and Levantine. And Pimsleur is all audio. I do suggest keeping notes and keeping a vocabulary list as you do it. But that'll get you some basic spoken Arabic. Choose one dialect. Don't try to do a lot, because then you're doing literally trying to do multiple languages. Once you feel well grounded in that, and maybe you've already started to find things you're interested in, whether it's music or poetry and things like that, and there's tons of stuff. I can talk more about that. You have to actually learn at this point how to bridge from your dialect to classical Arabic. And this is a skill that's not taught regularly or in really much of anywhere, except maybe now in some of the universities. And I can't really think off the top of my head of a good text that starts to break it down, except one older text from the State Department, I think from the 50s or something like that. But you have to say, okay, this is the dialect I learned, whether it's Levantine, whether it's Egyptian, Moroccan, Gulf, whatever it is. How do I take what I know from this and apply it here? It's like saying, okay, if I know German and I want to learn Dutch, I don't want to just start from scratch. I can connect what I know from German and more quickly learn Dutch now. So there's a lot to do, a lot you can do to make that easier to do that. And find something that you really love to do in the language. Language is about people at the end of the day. And you have to find some way that language is important to you. I've given talks at universities, and these students come up to me and they're like, well, I just want to work for the CIA. And I'm trying to be polite, but I'm like, how are you going to ever get good with the language if you're just sitting there reading miserable articles all the time about extremism and stuff? It's gonna you're gonna hate it. The language is gonna represent that to you. My son speaks the language and he speaks it fluently with me because, first and foremost, he loves me and as his father, and he sees the language as a way of interacting with me. And over time, we've built up more activities. Legos is a great activity with kids. You learn shapes, colors, what are you building, sizes, all this other stuff. Movies in Arabic are fun. There's a lot of actually good art in Arabic, or by Arabs, I should say. So you end up talking, what you study doesn't have to be language itself. You study something in the language. And then you also have to learn, unlike a unified language, specific skills like control and code switching. So what this refers to, so in English, obviously I'm talking in a more formal register here right now, right? So we switch registers from formal to informal, and it's natural, and as you grow up, you get used to it. You know, okay, I'm in an environment where I'm giving a talk, I need to be more formal. No, I'm just talking with my friends now, I can be more casual, and so forth. With a language or with a situation of diglossia, it gets a lot more complex because your formal register ends up moving into another language, in this case classical or standard Arabic, and your informal register is your mother tongue. So you have to learn how to switch when you go to a formal register to a more formal language. And how do you mix that? And a lot of that, again, it's not a skill that's actively taught typically, although now I do hear more professors talking about it at universities and things like that. But how do you teach it? How do you get control of the language? When do you mix? When do you not mix? You'll see native speakers in the news, for instance, they try to switch to a formal register, but maybe their command of classical Arabic isn't that good, so it's only like a half switch, things like that. So here are some parting words real quick, and then I do have one last message before I open up to questions. So we talked about marhaba as hello. Ismi, I didn't talk about the word ism because it's a root that is difficult and hard to work with, but ismi means my name. So ismi Hossam, my name is Hossam. Shukran is thanks. And we learned the word sharaf. Another word derived from that root is tasharrafna. Tasharrafna means we are honored. So tasharrafna, we're honored to meet you. So my last little note here for the day is, so when I agreed to give this talk, one of the reasons was about changing the perception of, I want to help change the perception of Arabic. So story behind that, a little story or an anecdote about that would be, years ago when all this generative AI was first coming out and you had these image generators, there was one called Crayon, but spelled AI instead of just A. And I was playing with it and having it produce different things. And then I started trying to type in Arabic and see what it would produce. And everything it produced, kind of funny, not funny story, everything it produced, no matter what I typed in, was an image of an extremist leader. And I tested it. Actually, I said I was going to try to test it again. I tested it, and it has gotten a bit better. If you guys want to, we can test it up here now and see what happens. It has gotten a bit better. But the images are still bad, and some of them still kind of lean toward that. So even though what I typed in to test it now was a full moon over the plains, and what it produced was a picture that looked kind of like Khomeini, the Iranian leader, and things, as well as other random things that didn't really match at all what I had asked it to make. So. And that's it, almost exactly 45 minutes. So we got 15 minutes for questions. Yes?
Are almost all books published in the formal?
Yes, so almost all books are. You are seeing a slight change in that. So and I'll differentiate actually between children's books and adult books. Egypt has kind of been in the lead. It's actually publishing more in dialect, I think, than any other country. And Egyptians, I think, have always been kind of close to their dialect. When you look at it historically, you can even find short-lived, but even as early, I think, as the 20th century, these short-lived newspapers that would appear in dialect. They've published a number of adult novels now in their dialect. They have also published some children's books. Now, children's literature becomes more of a sensitive topic, I think, for a lot of Arabs because they're like, no, these are children. We have to pass on classical Arabic to them. Without realizing that, or without thinking about the fact that, well, it's a lot easier for a kid to learn to read in the language they already know because they're connecting what they speak with what's on the page than it is to try to teach them the basics of reading, letters, phonetics, and so forth, and then at the same time teach them to read in a foreign language. the children's literature is kind of the bigger or harder fight, if you will. Again, Egypt is kind of in the lead. As far as I know, they have the most, but most is probably less than 50 books total in their dialect for kids. I mean, at one point I could comfortably say less than 12, but I know a few more have come out, and I don't want to underestimate. There is one publishing house in Lebanon that I know that publishes kids' books in dialect, but they've only published, I think, like half a dozen. Maybe that's it. So there's not much, and for kids it's hard. And for with my own son, I literally would translate books and then print the text out and then glue it onto the pages. And so we have like where the wild things are in Lebanese Arabic and all sorts of stuff. But he's kind of the exception.
This Silverstein is really good.
Yeah, I have a whole bunch of Shel Silverstein. It's actually, yeah, it's pretty awesome. I did it with my niece and nephew at one point, and like I read it to them, and it was just like crazy. Next.
There we go. So I'm not a Romance scholar or a Semitic scholar, but is there a comparison to be made between Latin and modern Romance languages and classical Arabic and all of the modern dialects of Arabic at all?
I'm also not a scholar of Romance languages, but I will answer that somewhat as much as I can. So a lot of languages were actually, if you will, what we think of now as like unified languages, like let's say Italian, where even within the recent past had a lot of dialects. I think I read somewhere that even within as late as the 19th century or 20th, even as early as the 20th century, Italian, only 2% of the population spoke what is now modern Italian. And there was a process of unification and so forth that it went through. The language was enforced. Now, a couple things are different between that story of Italian and Arabic. For one thing, Arabic has, like I said, frozen diglossia. There's no percent of people who speak modern standard Arabic at home in their houses, right? It's just not how it's done. And so passing it on to children encounters a lot of hurdles. I mean, there's obviously you have to be well educated to have really mastered classical Arabic, but then it has a constant formal tone, and you feel really weird talking to your child like you're giving a political speech or a Friday sermon or something like that. So it's just not passed on that way. Another challenge is the breadth, the sheer size of the Arab countries. And they all really have different paths. Like even if we all want to learn classical Arabic, they really need a different path. Moroccan, they have a different relationship with it culturally, but also just linguistically. If you're looking at the shortest path and you're looking for similarities, their path is different than, say, the Levantine path. The people in the Levant, meaning Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, and Jordan. So those two factors really make it quite different, and it's been argued by a couple of scholars that those qualities are really what have hindered the classical Arabic becoming sort of a dominant language, because so much money is pumped obviously into the education system in these countries, but it hasn't borne fruit, even though, especially in the 20th century, there's a lot of talk about Arab nationalism and so forth, and people thought, well, maybe they really wanted it. Like a lot of Arabs, like these scholars, these academics were writing, yeah, classical Arabic is going to unify us and things like that. But it never happened. So.
Sure, of course. So given that, especially for those of us with a stronger background like in English and maybe less so in Arabic, given that we don't have necessarily the same level of experience with diglossia, are there other, I know part of the answer to this having worked with you before, but are there other examples that really exhibit similar levels of diglossia? How might that be this similar or different?
So there are a number of studies, now I'm blanking on it, but the Professor John Myhill actually did a comparison, I want to say it was with Sri Lanka, because they also have a situation like this. And he argued that by them switching to a mother tongue first education for children, so they teach in the mother dialect, and then they slowly, switch to the more formal language over time, but they get the basics of reading down first in their mother dialect, and that made a drastic improvement in their reading level for children. I would also say a lot of countries do have multilingual, environments. Countries like Mozambique have 50+ languages spoken in them. South Africa has 11 official languages. In a lot of those cases, so like South Africa, they do start the education system in the mother tongue, and usually, for a lot of them, the Bantu language. And then it's only like 6th grade. They slowly over that at first, like English or sometimes Afrikaans is going to be treated as the sort of formal language, if you will. It's introduced as a foreign language initially. Kids learn it from a young age, but it's the language of education is consistently their mother tongue. And then it's only when they get older that the language of education moves more formally to becoming English or Afrikaans, depending on the school usually.
I wonder if we can go to the Living Arabic project for a second, because I'm very curious about what happens when we click on one of those words for cats.
Okay.
And I wonder also how you envision or how you know that people are using this to teach themselves Arabic, to teach their children. If you can speak to that.
Sure. So if you click on one of these arrows, so let's say the Egyptian here. So it brings up these different words. So word besbis is to call a cat, to make basically a pss, 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 make that kind of sound with a kitty. You have the word here ot, which is a tomcat or a male cat. And then you also have otta, which is a female cat. So the addition of that extra vowel at the end, the at the end makes it feminine. And you also have this word hir, which is used as a tomcat or cat. Although I would say that's probably, it's marked here with a U-E-A, meaning upper Egyptian Arabic. I kind of took that terminology from Said Badawi, a linguist who called anyhow, basically means more formal. So that's kind of what you see. So it brings it up, it has examples, you can see how it works, it gives you a pronunciation tip right here, things like that. How do I know that people are using it? Well, I record what searches are made. I don't record personal information, but I record the searches and I record whether or not they find results. And I do that so that over time I can occasionally check them and see if I can improve the search feature at all. Can I make it work better? So is it being used? I think last I checked, it's getting over 1 million searches per year. So, but I haven't checked in a little while. But like I said, that one professor said, I can't believe you're the only show in town. This really is the only website right now where you can do that. So I have to admit, it's not necessarily child friendly. I have taught my son to use it, actually, so he can look up words, because I'm like, well, when you don't know a word, you got to have a way to look it up now. And I know they use it in classes too, like for adults, there is a learning curve, especially for Arabic dictionaries. It's not like an English dictionary, actually. It's organized by root. So that concept of root that I introduced, you actually need to understand it to figure out how to derive words. And once you understand that root, you can actually then go back in and like figure out how the whole tree works and how it's all connected. I also know, for instance, so what I did here searching for cat, I know for people who are trying to learn multiple dialects, you can actually use this almost as a synonym across dialects. So we saw cat in Egyptian. If we then go and open up like Iraqi here, we can actually see, you can actually figure out what the comparison words would be in Iraqi. So if here you have bazoon, so in Egyptian it was ot, and here you can see bazoon for a male cat, bazoona for a female cat instead of otta, and so forth. So that's another way for people to help with bridging between dialects that you can use. As well as, of course, classical Arabic. You can open up the classical Arabic one at the top. And the other way is just, this is the only dictionary for a lot of dialects that you can access online. I've spent way too much time, you know, like I said, being that guy just like typing away in his basement and like watching too many TV shows and like not marking down new words and things like that. But just if you're watching a TV show or something and you're like, oh, I haven't heard that word before, let me see if it's here. You just go look it up and it should be here. To kind of put in perspective, the classical Arabic dictionary has about 80,000 rows of data in it. The Levantine dictionary has 30,000, and the Egyptian dictionary has 30,000 as well. So they're pretty robust dictionaries. I still do occasionally find new words. The whole documentation process is a whole other issue that I've like talked about, but it's at least, you know, I've filled it out as well as I can easily.
Yes, shukran. I paid attention. So one question or one comment more for your brother, then I think I have a historical example of a diglossia in the 1st, 2nd century CE Egypt. So we can talk about that. Linguists have really gotten down on and that's the terms that I see. Question for you now more. One of the things, how does it work with the diglossia and social differences? So in many societies, the elites are using a different language than well, the rest of the population. I mean, in historical periods in Europe, elites were talking French and people in the Netherlands were talking Dutch. And is that something that works also here? Do elites in these, do they speak the dialect or do they speak classical Arabic?
So they speak the dialect, but the situation is a bit more complex than that. I was in Egypt during the revolution, like 2011, 2012 time. And I remember some Egyptians really expressing frustration that these politicians would make speeches in classical Arabic and sit in their offices and give them speeches in classical Arabic. It just seemed so disconnected to them. It wasn't at all in the language of the people and so forth. There is also a sense, I think, so for instance, the former Egyptian president, Hosni Mubarak, without reading a speech, his classical Arabic seemed pretty horrible. And when he was doing informal interviews, he was very heavy in the dialect. Like that's how he was, that's how he spoke. So yeah, they do speak the dialect. That said, there is a sense of when someone is more educated and they kind of lean a bit more toward classical, they use more of the classical phrases maybe. They might change their pronunciation at times like that. There's a phrase in the Egyptian dictionary here that I found that people say, which is, he pronounces the qaf. So the qaf has this letter here. In the Egyptian dialect, it's typically said as an eh. It's not said as a full qaf. So the pronunciation of it as a full qaf is a sign of a more formal language. That phrase in Egyptian, oh, he speaks with a qaf, is considered kind of like a derogatory or an insult of like he thinks he's better than others and he speaks formally and things like that. It's not always like that. At the same time, like in a formal setting, somebody might purposely switch to a more formal register, use more classical Arabic as a kind of like prestige, you know, I'm better than you in talking and things like that. You see that quite a bit on debate shows. And it's interesting also in debate shows, some of the newscasters in particular who do the shows regularly, they're really good at classical Arabic because they practice it all the time. But when they get worked up and they're trying to like calm people down or something like that, they'll like falter and they'll slip back into their dialect and things like that. So it takes a level of control even in that circumstance.
Okay, I have two, but the first one's quick. Are most Friday sermons actually spoken in classical? You mentioned like a politician or a Friday sermon. If you were at masjid, would someone be speaking a dialect or like classical Arabic?
Typically classical. They will switch sometimes to explain things to their dialect, but it'll lean on classical.
Wow, okay.
So I think someone asked about Latin and in comparison to that. I do know Latin was for a long time preserved in the churches. And my understanding is that one of the reasons they started to switch to different languages was because people just didn't understand Latin anymore. In this case, the solution in the Arabic countries has been like, well, we'll still use the classical Arabic as much as we can, but a lot of the speakers will then like do an explanation then in like their dialect and then switch back. But it will depend on the mosque, the speaker. For instance, pre-war, the circumstances in Syria are different now. Pre-war, a lot of Syrians were well educated. They had a really strong command of classical Arabic. They were known for it. Of course, not all of them, but you know, there was definitely that crowd, and they were comfortable speaking, I think, in the mosques, for instance, in classical Arabic fully. What the speaker was giving the sermon. That's not the case necessarily in every country or in every village or community.
Okay. And if you're writing a letter to someone, are you typically writing it in your dialect or would you, because if books aren't published, my situation is I'm trying to learn Iraqi Arabic from an Iraqi man.
Okay.
And sometimes he'll be writing things and it's like he's not really written it this way before, you know? Like.
So, no, they're actually a lot of times written in classical Arabic. And it'll depend on the person. So social media has really, like, the growth of social media, these chat programs and things like that has really changed it. We write way more in dialect than we ever did before. But there's a couple issues with that. One is there's not a standardized way of writing dialects. Like, spelling is really haphazard. For this dictionary, for instance, I have created a system for myself where it's like, well, I want to keep it as close as possible to standard Arabic. And I didn't get into this point, so let me I should take a little tangent here. Standard Arabic is what we call a transparent writing system, meaning that every letter consistently stands for that same sound time and time again. There's no like weird switches and suddenly we want UEA instead of just UE, or, nothing like that, nothing like English. It's transparent. My rule for this has been write it as close to classical Arabic as possible, as long as I can still explain the phonetics consistently. So that there might be the pronunciation might change, but there's a document. If I go over here, for instance, it's either under learning or articles. Let me just check real quick. So like phonetic notes on a Gulf dialect. What you could basically, the spelling will be as consistent as possible with classical Arabic, but you need this document kind of as a background if you don't know anything about Gulf phonetics to tell you how to make sure you get the pronunciation right, if that makes sense. So yes, letters and things like that are typically written. Like I said, it has changed with social media and stuff like that. And when I write to friends, for instance, on WhatsApp, or I'm chatting with them or something like that, I will switch registers in certain times, depending on what I want to convey and what I'm trying to get across. I also very much am like, I don't want to lean on English vocabulary for technical terms necessarily, so my writing at times might come across as more formal because I'm going to use the correct, if we don't have a term for it in dialect, I'm going to use the standard Arabic term. Whereas some of them, like the guys who work on the website, for instance, they'll be like, the database, el-database. And I'm like, no, al-qa'idat al-bayanat. Sorry. Like, no, I got the right word, you guys. It's okay. So I don't know. It's kind of a choice you make.
Thank you so much. This has been fantastic. We really appreciate you coming.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.